A lot of American life and the definition of success is centered around money. The idea of making enough money so that you can be financially independent, that you can afford to relax for the rest of your life, take it easy, and enjoy the so-called good life. I'm not going to try and answer the question of whether that particular interpretation of the American dream is right or wrong. What I'm going to do instead is answer a different question, which is, how much money do you need to be able to safely retire? Hi, I'm John Miller, the Deliberate Engineer. I spent much of the last 30 years working as a software engineer, a lot of it in big tech companies like Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and so on. I watched lots of my friends and colleagues become millionaires, watched some of them retire, never to come back, watch others come back after a year, and sometimes work for decades more. Now, before I go any further, I want to emphasize one thing. I am not a financial expert. I'm not a financial planner. You should treat this video as just one person's story of how they went about deciding for them what was enough. If you're actually planning on retiring, use this as a way of figuring out questions that you would ask and go see a financial planner or do your own due diligence. Again, this is not qualified financial advice. This is a collection of my observations. You may have seen one of my earlier videos where I talked about missing making millions of dollars at Microsoft in the 90s. After I came back to Microsoft, after missing those millions, I happened to be walking around campus one day around 2004, and I saw an old colleague of mine. Let's call him Alan. Alan looked remarkably unhappy. In the first minute or two of talking to Alan, it was pretty clear. He wasn't enjoying his work. It was a grind, it was hard, it was unpleasant, there was always something going wrong. So I looked at him and said, well, Alan, you've got to be a millionaire by now, several times over. Why don't you just retire if it's really that awful? And he looked at me and sort of laughed and said, how much is enough? At the time, I thought it was a ridiculous question. The guy's a multimillionaire. Of course he can retire. But later on, I started thinking about it a little more deeply and realized it wasn't as obvious as it seemed. I'd always thought that being a millionaire would mean that you could retire and take it easy the rest of your life. This just isn't true, at least if you're used to living a relatively good quality of life, and especially if you want to retire early. $1 million is nowhere near enough. After doing a bit of reading online and studying up on things, I came up with a simple answer and a more complicated answer. The simple answer is something called the 4% rule. What it says is, when you get to the point where the amount of money you want to draw down is less than 4% of the principal that you have saved up, then it's probably safe for you to retire, assuming that you're retirement age. This gets a little more complicated if you're not retirement age because lots of things become variables. It turns out one of the underlying assumptions of this so-called 4% model is that you're going to run out of money within 30 years or so. It's not meant to make you have money forever. It's just meant to say chances are good that when you get to the end of 30 years, you'll still have a few cents in your account. So do I recommend you use this as a metric for whether or not you can retire? Absolutely not. But it can give you an idea of whether you're close enough to being able to retire that you could afford to spend some time digging into it, talking to financial planners, getting financial advice, and so on. In other words, before you spend all that effort, making sure that you're close enough that it makes sense to do. For the rest of this video, I'll spend time explaining to you how I came to my own answer of how much, as well as talking a bit about the different factors that you should take into account as you research your own answer. Also, I'll talk a little bit about how financial planners run simulations to see whether they think it's safe for you to retire and to be able to give you sort of a probability that your retirement will be successful according to the parameters that you set. I'm American living in the U.S., paying U.S. taxes. So all of my experience is based around the U.S. and its tax system. If you live in a different country with different tax laws, with different retirement laws, well, you'll have to do some adjustment and some adaptation of what I'm talking about here for it to be of any use to you. To be able to answer the question of how much money you need, there are three primary factors. The first is how much you want to be able to spend per year. The second is what age you want to retire at. And the third one is how long you think you will need retirement income. In other words, how long are you going to live after you retire? Let's say that you want to be able to retire and keep the quality of life you have today. The first thing you have to do is be able to quantify how much you're spending per year. The best way to do this, at least in my opinion, is to take a look at your last 3 years of expenditures, add it all together, and divide it by 3. This should include things like property taxes, the amount of money you spend on insurance, new car purchases or fractions of them, maintenance, and all the utilities you have at home. Just in general, the money that you're spending. So let's say that you do this exercise and it turns out that you spend $8,000 a year on property taxes. You own your home outright. Good for you. You spend another $8,000 a year on your car and car expenses. Maybe you spend $20,000 a year on everything else you do. And bear in mind, you're going to have some sort of health insurance if you're not already old enough for Medicare. In other words, if you're not 65, then you're probably going to want to buy some form of Obamacare. For these calculations, we'll assume that there's two of you that you're insuring, you and a partner. That's going to wind up being another probably $20,000 a year. So for our example, let's say that you realize that you're spending $70,000 a year right now. And so that's your target of net income that you want to have available to you in retirement every year. You notice that I said $70,000 a year of net income. That's because you're going to have to pay taxes on some or all of your retirement income. Certainly any money that you have in some sort of investment that you cash out, that's going to have capital gains tax on it. The Social Security that you receive, well, you'll also have to pay taxes on that. And any other sources of income. For example, let's say your investments get dividends, you'll owe tax on that too. So for our purposes, what we'll say is for that $70,000, we actually need, we have 20% tax overhead. So we really need to have $84,000 gross a year. Then after taxes, we'll have that $70,000 to spend. Don't forget about taxes as you're making these calculations. Once you hit 65, Medicare will kick in and you won't have to pay for your own health insurance anymore. So that's $20,000 net less a year that you need. Also, once you hit 67, then that's sort of the best time to start withdrawing from Social Security. The amount you can get can be up to $40,000 a year. It's going to depend on the total dollar amount you put in and how much you put in per year for how many years. There's actually a calculator that you can go and look at that's offered by the Social Security Administration that will tell you roughly what they think your Social Security payments will be. Let's say that the Social Security payments are another $20,000. At retirement, once you hit 67, you'll be paying $40,000 less a year. You don't have to pay insurance, and you get that Social Security that can replace some of the money you would have been withdrawing. When we think about calculating the money that we need for retirement, we really have two phases. The first is if you're doing early retirement, you want to count all that money for extra insurance and not having Social Security. And then to make it easier, we'll calculate from 67 onwards, saying Social Security and Medicare take care of some extra expenses. One of the questions you need to answer is, should you be shooting for a 30-year time horizon or is it something longer? I mentioned earlier the best way to figure this out is to take a look at how long you can expect to live and then maybe have a little buffer on top of that. Lucky for you, the government actually has tables. The CDC has tables that give you what the mortality rates are, what the expected life expectancy is for somebody based on their age. The way it works is we do have an average age, say based on gender and race for somebody in the US that you can expect to reach. If you've already made it past some of the hurdles that you have earlier on, say infant sickness and childhood sickness, and then making it through your teenage years, which is a miracle for everybody on its own, then your chances of living go up in terms of how long you're going to live. So the overall life expectancy for somebody who is only 10 years old might be something along the lines of 75. But if you're already 50 and you look at your life expectancy, you may find it's more like 80 to 81 years old. So go ahead and take a look at that CDC table. I'm including a link to it. Once you've set aside a substantial amount of money, typically you would put it somewhere where it can keep earning, like stocks, bonds, mutual funds, things like that. But you can't assume that all of that money is going to be available to you. One of the most complicated things about planning for retirement is taking inflation into account and coming up with the balance between the income you earn on your investments and the inflation. That lets me keep the rest of the calculations in current dollars rather than in depreciated dollars as time goes forward. Complicated, but it'll make more sense when you look at the spreadsheet that I'm going to link to. In keeping with this theme of working in today's dollars, what you do then is you say, well, I have a certain lump of principal that's going to keep growing. I make my annual withdrawals from that to fund my retirement, and I also have to account for inflation. So one way that you can do that is by taking the amount of appreciation you expect on average for your investments, let's say 5%, and you subtract out inflation from that, let's say 3%. That lets you keep the amount that you're withdrawing every year in today's dollar, so it would stay constant, and you would see the actual growth, if any, of your investments, or still be able to take that into account year over year and see how much your principal shrinks by. What you see here is part of the sample spreadsheet that I'm talking about using for these calculations. Now, it includes a bunch of parameters at the top that you can adjust. Let's say a starting balance that you already have in your savings, and then you can say what you think inflation is going to be on average, what you think the appreciation is going to be on average, the effective tax rate that you want to consider. I just put 20% in as a placeholder. Effective tax isn't your latest tax. We have a graduated tax rate in the US, which means your first couple dollars don't get taxed at all. Then after that, it might be at 10% and then at 15% and so on. You can calculate the effective tax rate by dividing the taxes that you've paid over the total amount that you earned. The table down below has 5 different columns. One is the age that you're looking at and wondering how much money you have and how much you have to draw down your investments. Next is how much Social Security is going to kick in to the total amount that you want to have. The next column after that is the drawdown, which is the remainder that you have to actually pull out of your investments, the principal at the start of that particular year, and then any return you get after a year of that principal based on the return you specified minus inflation. Now, if you look further down in the spreadsheet, you'll see that when you hit 67 years old, there's a big shift in how much you're withdrawing and how quickly your principal is shrinking. It's still shrinking, but instead of pulling out, $84,000 a year, you're pulling out more like 40s, somewhere in the 40s, which makes the rest of the money shrink a lot slower. You still wind up with this sort of average scenario with a little bit of money at the end, nowhere near as much as you had at the beginning, but at least it's something. As you do these calculations, realize this is no representation of reality. It's not a safe number to use. It's actually quite difficult to estimate the impact of the variability of the market on what your investments are going to look like in 5 years or 10 years and 20 years. It's so difficult that most people don't even try it because it's not reliable. What financial advisors do instead is use something called a Monte Carlo simulation. A Monte Carlo simulation is nothing more than taking a set of inputs and rolling dice to say, well, which input do I use this year? Which input do I use this year? And so on. And then running a trial. For example, you might go year by year or month by month from right now until the date that you expect to die, whatever that is, the time horizon that you specify. And they will do the simulation based on actual financial behavior in the past. It may be modified by any of their assumptions about what the market's going to do in the future. Each year they'll apply sort of a random market condition to it. You could get really unlucky in the simulation and wind up with 3 years in a row where you lose 20%. On the other hand, there might be a run where they do nothing but have positive years every single year, and you wind up with 10 times the money that you started with by the time you're ready to kick the bucket. That's also very improbable. Anyways, what they do is they're going to make a decision, successful or unsuccessful. If you have money left at the end of the window that you're doing the calculation for, that's a successful run. If you run out of money before that time that you specified as the end of your retirement window, then you're unsuccessful. What they'll do is they'll run a whole bunch of these simulations, choosing randomly each year what the performance is, and then calculate what percentage of them were successful versus unsuccessful. So for example, they might say, well, you got a 90% success rate for going 50 years from now based on the market parameters we have. That's actually really good. Or they might say you have a 5% chance of success, and you can take from that you're very likely, all things being equal, to run out of money before the end of that retirement window. There's lots of free Monte Carlo simulators out there for planning retirement and seeing what your stocks and your savings are likely to do. You can actually run these Monte Carlo simulations yourself. Just go to your favorite search engine and search for Monte Carlo Retirement Tool and look at the various websites that offer it. Pick a website you trust, for example, Vanguard or maybe Standard & Poor's, and fill out the parameters that they specify, and then it'll run as many Monte Carlo simulations as you want and give you what your likely success probability is, and maybe even a drawdown curve on average for how things look. So wrapping things up, I first want to say again, I'm not a financial planner. I looked at some of this stuff. I'm one person who has some information. Here's the information. It's more intended to let you see if you're close enough to being able to retire, to dig into it further with a financial planner or somebody else who's actually qualified. It'll also give you some information about how to think about retiring and the sorts of things that you should take into account. So I hope it does both of those things. Now, summing it up, we took a look at how to figure out how much you're going to need for a year for retirement, assuming that you don't want your lifestyle to change. We talked a bit about some of the assumptions and calculations that go into it. and we talked about the Monte Carlo simulation that a financial planner or you yourself would run to see if you really have enough money to retire. If you've already retired or if you're thinking about retiring, I'd love to hear what you think about this. Does it jive with your thoughts about retirement and about the way that you go about planning it? Do you have other ideas that people might be able to benefit from? Or am I just crazy? I'd love to hear what you think down below, so go ahead and leave a comment. Thanks for making it this far, and as always, keep on pushing forward. Hi, this is John. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please think about subscribing so you get notified of my future videos. Also, if you are interested, you might want to check out the video I have linked here. Thanks, and keep on pushing forward.